Well, thank you for the invitation to speak to you today, and welcome all my friends and past colleagues. I too would like to acknowledge the Wadawurrung people for their custodianship for the country for millennia and the role of the current and future First Nation leaders in continuing this responsibility. The Woodlanders of Walden Hut were three young men who rented a hut along the Olinda Creek in the Dandenongs between 1903 and 1907. Born in the colonial period building to nationhood, the men were inspired by Henry David Thoreau's foundational book on nature, Walden. In this talk, I would like to set out who the Woodlanders were and introduce the ideas of Thoreau, the American poet and nature writer. Some discussion of the men, their visitors at the hut, and other nature writing in the early period of nationhood allows a consideration of the gender dimensions of nature writing and the thread of the spiritual in nature. Ballarat features in three of those friends or followers, but this is mainly a story of Melbourne and Victoria. Okay, who were the Woodlanders? We have Melbourne dwellers, Claude Kinane, B. Brooke Nichols and Charles Barrett, who rented this cottage along the Olinda Creek. It's along Swansea Road on the edge of Mount Evelyn, where I was born, Lilydale and Mooroolbark, between 1903 and 1907. The area had already come to the attention of field naturalists as they had already visited and done bird watching there. And at the turn of the century, there was in this area on the floodplain of the Olinda Creek a small village settlement called Olinda Vale, formed under the Closer Settlement Acts of the 1890s, very small plots in that depression area. The three men dubbed their cottage Walden Hut after Thoreau's book Walden and called themselves the Woodlanders after toying with the idea of calling themselves the Waldenites. Their writings appeared in detail, don't laugh, in the New Idea, but this was a different new idea. This new idea was a woman's home journal for Australasia, a serious journal for those times. And individually, they also wrote newspaper pieces, journal articles and books, and took photographs and made films and recordings after many subsequent expeditions throughout Australia and its near neighbours. Now, Brooke Nichols and Charles Barrett met on a fishing boat adventure cruise to the Bass Strait. They found they shared a deep admiration for Thoreau and devised a scheme whereby they would rent a cottage on the Olinda Creek and spend all their spare time observing and writing about nature. Barrett asked a former schoolmate, Claude Kinane, to join them. Now, Kinane's father in Brighton rented his cottage on the family orchard to Frederick McCubbin, so it is likely that Kinane grew up acquainted with visitors associated with the nationalistic Heidelberg School of Nature painters. Kinane at this time was working as a law clerk. He wasn't all that happy in the city. And Barrett was a journalist at the Argus, and Nichols was a qualified dentist, able to financially support the venture more than the others. When they began this adventure at Walden Hut, Barrett and Kinane were 24 and Nichols was 26. Okay, so now I'm going to have just a little look for those who don't know about Thoreau and Walden. Henry David Thoreau, born in 1817 and died in 1862, was from Concord, Massachusetts, and he was a natural scientist who gave us the deep poetry of nature writing. The hut by Walden Pond, about which Henry Thoreau wrote his influential book Walden, has been rebuilt, and the replica has become a site for pilgrimage for students of nature writing and for environmentalists. Classically educated and exposed to religious debates at home, Thoreau became a spiritual seeker. After some studies at Harvard, he lived in a hut he built himself on the land of the poet Emerson between 1845 and 1847 in the glacial Walden Pond not far from Concord. This sojourn became an experiment in living, and his book Walden expressed his longing for, quote, a deep connection with the land. It became a new sacred book for the modern age. In the slide, we can see the little cairns of rocks and the quotation from Thoreau at the site of the pilgrimage. There is also a replica hut, and this project for me arose out of COVID and having a new Kindle, COVID and Kindle, and I read a lot of the old free classical books, and I should say that Tom Griffiths was the person who brought the Woodlanders to our attention in an early book called Hunters and Collectors, and that my colleague at Mount Evelyn, Karen Phillips, had written several articles about them over the years, since the 90s, and it was reading Thoreau's Walden finally during COVID on Kindle that I presented myself back to my hometown and said, I think we should have a replica hut and a site for pilgrimage. Now, that hasn't exactly happened, but... Now, Thoreau's sensitivity to the pain of others, humans, extended to the non-human world of animals and plants, and so some people say it was a gateway to modern environmental ethics. He wanted to fully possess the earth and embodied and sensual contact, and he had lovely essays on walking in the forest and so forth. So you have this sensual contact through walking on its surface. For him, God was in nature. His beliefs, which in early 19th century America were described as transcendental, like Plato, trusting insights beyond logic and experience for our deepest insights. They put him in opposition to established church and were sometimes considered heretical. Thoreau was interested in the Native American forebears. He learned a local language, he felt their presence on the earth, and he wrote what he could about their culture in a series of 12 big notebooks. But Thoreau was also a scientist, one of the first Americans to read The Origin of Species cover to cover, and he was pleased to find it added weight to his already noted observations on ecological succession in ponds and forest. He brought the poetry and spirituality of nature together with the science. When Thoreau published Walden in 1854, it provided inspirational quotations that if you look up on Google, you will find a number of them, embodying his response to the commercialising and industrialising world around him. One of them, I learned this, at least by my experiment, that if one advances confidently in the direction of his dreams and endeavours to live the life which he has imagined, he will meet with success unexpected in common hours. In his life experiment next to Walden Pond, Thoreau endeavoured to survive with minimal work, minimal food, clothing and shelter. He tried to pare down the barriers between a person and nature. He observed in rich and scientific and sensory detail the changing seasonal environments, the flora, the fauna, the itinerant people passing through, and the lake itself, Walden Pond. And his quote about the lake was an example of his writing. A lake is the landscape's most beautiful and expressive feature. It is Earth's eye, looking into which the beholder measures the depth of his own nature. The fluviatile trees next to the shore are the slender eyelashes which fringe it, and the wooded hills and cliffs around are its overhanging brows. So nature writing for him is supplementary to scientific endeavour. It embraces emotion, spirit and sensory responses. I will now look at what the Woodlanders wrote and captured on camera during their weekends and holidays between 1903 and 1907. The top, an eminent Australian environmental historian, Tom Griffiths, sees the series of articles the Woodlanders wrote for the New Idea, as the poet Bernard O'Dowd wrote, as a beginning towards a nature history of Melbourne, comparable to the natural history of Selborne, written by famous English nature writer Gilbert White. They incorporate rural folk and introduce plants and birds in their detailed sensory descriptions and brilliant bird photography for the times. And two examples should give you a taste. I've written one down so you can read that in the next 30 seconds. Another quotation I have, by the way, although they signed off as Woodlanders, it was indeed Charles Barrett who did the bulk of the writing for these articles. Along the winding course of the creek, the olive green pinnacles of the slender sassafras contrast strongly with the darker rounder summits of the Blackwoods, and the silvery white gleam of the wattle stands out, a conspicuous curving line in the vast expanse of leaves. Clothing the opposite slope and stretching away beyond the crest of the ridge to the distant skyline line is an undulating surface of dark evergreen foliage, unbroken save where the trunks and limbs of a few dead giant eucalypts, once, quote, green-robed senators of the forest, stand as bleaching skeletons, emblems of mortality in the midst of life. So this sort of writing is a bit more advanced than what we might get in a contemporary New Idea article. The photograph there was considered amazing in its day because Claude Canane would climb up and sit for hours on trees or in ponds and take this photo of a cuckoo ejecting a bird. Yeah. Now, I have to mention someone who's not from Victoria but from Queensland, but who was an exemplar for the Woodlanders, and he's quite important in the node of network of nature writers. So they had an associate in Queensland, and he was dubbed the Beachcomber. Edmund Banfield was revered for his Thoreau-inspired chosen lifestyle on Dunk Island, and his writings in Confessions of a Beachcomber in 1908 contain many quotations from Thoreau. For example, if a man does not keep pace with his companions, perhaps it is because he hears a different drummer. Let him step to the music which he hears. Although Banfield did not visit Walden Hut, two of the Woodlanders and two of their protégés corresponded with him, and Charles Barrett and his wife did visit him and became quite good friends. What I'm going to move now to, well, Banfield actually wasn't alone. He had a wife, a faithful Irish servant, and itinerant Aboriginal people helping him on the island as well. But he did try and survive on goats and things he wrote with the paper. Yeah. So this is the photo that we advertised the talk with, and it doesn't actually have the three Woodlanders, but it does have Donald MacDonald, then Brooke Nichols, then Ernest Scott, the Professor of History at Melbourne Uni later, and then Brooke Nichols' brother, Frank. So in midlife, Charles Barrett recalled his youth and Walden Hut. I have pleasant memories of our days together in the bush and the nights given over to talk of men and books and natural history. At Walden Hut, the three Woodlanders planned ventures and were as foolish, I suppose, in their visions of a brave new world as any other young men of a generation ago or today. Many of the visitors to Walden Hut were unnamed. For example, in 1906, Adelaide representatives of the Royal Australasian Ornithologists Union joined some Geelong field naturalists, making a group of 15 to be entertained in that hut along Olinda Creek. The visitors named below give an idea of some of the interests and ideas which were being shared alongside the Olinda Creek soon after the turn of the century. Firstly, the man on the left, Donald MacDonald. Tom Griffiths sees him as the real start of the nature writing in Australia, and he was British born. He had served in the Boer War and was inspired by Rudyard Kipling and Baden-Powell to encourage a manly bush-savvy culture for boys. He mentored Charles Barrett at the Argus. So he was at the Argus and he mentored the young journalist Charles Barrett. He wrote a regular nature column and he encouraged the use of common descriptive names for plants rather than always the scientific one. And he humanised both birds and animals. He invited Barrett and other young nature lovers to what he termed the huts at a Black Rock residence he had for weekends. And then in turn, he visited the Woodlanders at Walden Hut. So his foundational role in Australian nature writing is commemorated by a memorial at Beaumaris or Black Rock. The second person is our first link with Ballarat, Bernard O'Dowd, 1866 to 1953. O'Dowd was almost certainly one of the poets to visit Walden Hut, and he has a link to Ballarat. Born in Beaufort, he went to school at Soldiers Hill and Mount Pleasant, from where he matriculated, and he studied first year Melbourne University Arts from Grenville College in Ballarat. But when his father was injured, he was first forced to go to work, and at age 17, he was offered the headmastership of St. Alypius. He didn't last there due to his increasing secularism and scientism, and eventually he took a public service exam and worked in the Crown Solicitor's office in Melbourne and completed an arts and law degree. In 1900, just before Australia federated, O'Dowd's poem, Australia, was a prize winner. And he was, in 1908, in the Socialist Journal, the reviewer of Charles Barrett's first book, From Range to Sea. And in Barrett's book, From a Bush Hut, he refers to a city poet visitor with radical views, wanting bush background for a poem. Now, O'Dowd was interested in Unitarianism and Theosophy, and Wallace Crabbe said his poetry treated the national landscape as profoundly numinous or spiritual. And he actually came and lived next door to Mount Evelyn and that creek site very close at Montrose later on. Now, the second photo there on the right is of Ernest Scott, who was in that group photo. And he was a former journalist from the Herald from 1892 and a Hansard recorder from Parliament. Now, Scott was not university trained, but he worked hard and systematically, and he wrote 2 books on the early history of Australia, one in 1910 on French exploration and one on Matthew Flinders in 1912. And on the basis of these 2 books he'd written, in 1913 he was invited to become the chair of history at Melbourne University. And Scott was a Liberal who supported votes for women and in the 1930s was anti-fascist. So we get a bit of an idea of another person who visited and talked with these people. The next person, Richard Treblecop, was born in Ballarat, but he grew up in Geelong and had completed his law degree at the University of Melbourne. But just before his final examinations in 1903, he was given the opportunity to replace a photographer, who we'll mention in a minute, who's in that photo on the on the right, on the horse, to replace him on a expedition to Siberia with a man called Rodney Hall, looking for the eggs of the birds that migrate to Australia. And in those days, they collected them all. they collected eggs and, took them, basically. His photographs of that expedition, that's one of them there, and subsequent talks gained much publicity when he returned, and he visited Walden Hut as the Honourable Secretary of the Geelong Field Naturalists in 1906, but he spent much of his older adult life in Kerrang. Now, the man on the horse is Arthur Mattingly, who worked in the Customs Office in Melbourne and took leading positions in a number of conservationist bodies, including the Royal Australasian Ornithologists Union, RAOU, and the Victorian Advisory Council of Flora and Fauna. He was a pioneer bird photographer, and he became a strong crusader for conservation when he came across 50 slaughtered egrets and about 200 starving chicks at St Helena Swamp near Mathara, just over the Murray River. His image of starving chicks shocked Australia and had considerable influence around the world. His photographs illustrate articles by the woodlander Charles Barrett, so they almost certainly knew each other. And yes, there was a whole lot of lobbying at that period to ban the use of feathers in hats, and that's a march in London. And the information on him comes from Philip McCouat, Fashion, Feathers and Animal Rights, the Journal of Art and Society, 2016. So an interesting little article on that. Now, I'm going to, from several walks of life and with a variety of expertise, ideas and experience, visitors to Walden Hut were all amateur naturalists with a love of the Australian bush. Although some of the larger visiting groups from clubs may have included females, the known and most likely visitors were male. And it's before these men married. About 1907, they start getting engaged and married. Now, scholars such as Tom Griffiths have remarked on the male and national focus of this early movement, demonstrating love of Australian nature. And Griffiths believes what was happening with nature writing is equally important to what was happening with artist groups who were beginning to love their nation by being able to paint their trees properly and all that sort of thing. And it's important to recognise that in another sphere, though, this wasn't totally a male sort of development, because in the area of writing for young children, women writers were also cultivating a love of enchanted nature and conservationist values. That's moving a little bit into fiction, but if you look at some of these early books, which you can for nothing on Kindle, from the Gutenberg Press, you can see what they wrote in their cover messages to the mothers and the children. Libby Robin claims that the publication of Dot and the Kangaroo by Ethel Pedley in 1899 was a beginning for the reimagining of the Australian bush as friendly. The book was dedicated to the children of Australia in the hope, quote, of enlisting their sympathies for the many beautiful, amiable and frolicsome creatures of their fair land, whose extinction is being surely accomplished through ruthless destruction. Between 1916 and 21, we have in New South Wales May Gibbs following with the Snugglepot and Cuddlepie books that opened with a plea for children to desist from pulling out wildflowers by the roots. If you're going to pick them, don't kill them, but I think picking them might kill them. And she celebrated the botanical structures of local flora. Meanwhile, less well known, but in Melbourne, two sisters, Ida Rental Outhwaite or I'm not sure whether it's Outhwaite or Outhwaite, and Annie Rental, published books such as The Little Green Road to Fairyland, which was what our family had, between 1906 and the 1930s. And that was drawing on the flora and fauna of Victoria and Melbourne, and Mount Macedon and Lorne, where they visited quite a lot. In this case, they animated the space with sort of sylph-like English fairies, but also those inspired by the bush. And in the image I've got the little she-oak who wishes he was a he-oak. The gum nut, which I rather love. That's from the Rental and Outhwaite. So, before making judgments about Australian nature writing, I think we have to be inclusive to discover the contribution of Australian women, and it's not always in the centre stage. It might be in the children's literature or somewhere else. The non-rational, sensed world in this writing and art is magic, an enchanted world, rather than a nature spiritually espoused by Thoreau. Got to keep my... Now, I'm now going to look at what the Woodlanders as individuals achieved later in life. It appeared they didn't stay all that close friends after they married, but they wrote obituaries for each other and things. But one journalist referred to Brooke Nichols as a man who made dreams come true because he had a bit of money and he was enthusiastic. It was his idea to go to the hut. It was his idea to write books and all this stuff. He's also accredited with starting the craze for going home from the bush visits to outer Melbourne in places like Mount Evelyn and Ferntree Gully and so forth with gum tips. It was he who did it first, evidently, according to one journalist. He had special ties to Healesville and to the creation of Healesville Sanctuary. And although thwarted in his ambitions to publish lots of books, he wrote 2 children's books, which are rather delightful, Jacko the Broadcasting Kookaburra and Billy the Penguin. And he collaborated with Frank Dolby Davison on a travel book, which one scholar believes is a new type of genre in Australia, the road trip sort of, the travel genre, called Blue Coast Caravan. He gave many talks, some for a summer program at Berkeley University, California. He promoted new film and recording technology, and he broadcast a nature show on Radio LO, 3LO. He made some of the earliest documentary films on the turtle, platypus, and Aboriginal ceremonial life. And his recordings of Jacko were made into a record, and his footage became the logo of Movietone News. So he's responsible for that laugh on the Movietone News. Now, Nichols obtained sponsorship or introductions from high government officials, amateur and professional scientists, and scientific bodies such as the Gould League. He was part of a number of expeditions, and in the decade of the 1920s, and his wife, they remained childless, and she was a naturalist too, visited Moa Island, Torres Straits, Central Australia, Northwest Ireland on the Great Barrier Reef, England, and a US fish and wildlife established, as well as Berkeley University. So he was out and about a lot in the 20s. And then at the end of the decade, he was in New Guinea on the Nichols-Congreve expedition to Papua to gather and photograph arts and crafts. His expeditions brought him to an interest in Aboriginal culture, and he has notes on why Australia should be called the living rather than the centre of Australia should be called the living heart, not the dead heart of Australia. Yeah. And that's one of the articles about his expedition, but it's not him, it's the cook, the cook with the turtle's eggs or whatever. And the turtle island he wrote about was actually Northwest Island. Positions filled by Nichols include that of a director at the Melbourne Zoo, an advocate for the Healesville Sanctuary, a founder of the Gould League of Bird Lovers of Victoria, and writer for the RAOU journal, the Emu, as well as for the Argus and the Herald. Now, that photograph at the bottom, you may see a little kookaburra on the bonnet of the caravan. It was an old war ambulance, evidently. He went on a promotional tour about his children's book, and actually, I think the follow-up book was about the trip. They went right up to northern Queensland with their kookaburra, and they met with children along the way who were collecting grubs and things for Jacko, and all sorts of things happening. And basically, now he's remembered at Healesville, because he did have a dental practice there for a while. And he was commemorated at the Healesville Sanctuary by a sundial, which has now been demolished. And he also left a prize in dentistry as a bequest to University of Melbourne, which still exists. So Brooke Nichols didn't achieve as much fame as Charles Barrett. But his books were illustrated by Dorothy Wall, who must have said, "I can do this better," and wrote Blinky Bill. So she illustrated both his books, the Penguin one and the Jacko one, and he'd commissioned her to do it. And then following that, and in fact, Brooke Nichols invented Blinky Bill. Blinky Bill was part of a concert performance. They had a koala, and people would come to watch, and they'd have the laughing kookaburra, and they'd have this koala on the branch that he named Blinky Bill. So if you read Blinky Bill carefully, you'll notice Dorothy Wall acknowledges the godfather, Jacko Kookaburra. So she sort of acknowledges Brooke Nichols. All very intriguing. Okay, Claude Kinane, he penned himself as the artist, but he was a photographic artist, and we don't even have a clear picture of him. We've got these silhouettes, and right up the tree or with his back to us and his ribs showing, sitting in the pond or the water for hours on end to get his photographs. And in those days, they were glass plates, gelatin plates or something, and they were heavy, and they had to be carried up the trees that they were climbing with sort of spurs on. So the photographs we have of Claude show the lengths he would go to obtain a good bird photograph. He was the only woodlander to try to survive permanently on the land in Gippsland, and later in Mount Evelyn he came back to the area, close to what had been Walden Hut. And both enterprises were difficult and, hard to succeed. He struggled with disease and randomly lit bushfires and things like that, and cattle tramping on stuff. When he died of a road accident at age 45, the Emu published an obituary noting the fine work in nature photography that had attracted much attention years ago, in particular with that photograph of the cuckoo, which was sent over to the British Museum. Okay, so the most famous was Charles Barrett, 1879 to 1959. He lived the longest too. And he was born in Hawthorn. He was the author of more than 100 popular books on topics ranging from natural history, travel, ordinary history and Indigenous Australians, to social life and customs. He was a member of the literary staff of the Melbourne Herald, or Argus Herald, for 33 years, and from 1906 conducting the Wild Nature Notes page, the Australian Boys page, and the Campfire in the Weekly Times. He wrote and edited children's books. He edited the birdwatcher magazine Emu between 1910 and 1916, the Victorian Naturalist between 1925 and 40, and the Scout magazine Pals between 1920 and 1927. He collected insects and sent them to entomologists across in other parts of the world. He became quite an icon in this period about the 30s and 40s, and during the war, he wrote something that the troops could take with them called the Swagman's Notebook, and 100,000 copies were printed and issued to troops. And he was involved in World War I, II in Egypt, in the sort of a journalistic context. Barrett took on administrative positions between 1929 and 41 in the Field Naturalist and the Royal Zoological Society of New South Wales. His series of Sun Nature books reached a circulation of nearly 1 million, and he was a Fellow of the London and New York Zoological Societies. And in 1956, he edited the Australian Junior Encyclopedia. In his expeditions to the north and centre of Australia, Barrett too became entranced by Aboriginal culture and sites. And in 1953, he was awarded the Australian Natural History Medallion in recognition of his lifetime promoting a love of nature. His role in mentoring others featured Interested in Nature brings us to an examination of a network of nature writers. I'm mentioning a few, but I'll have to be fairly quick because I've got about 7 minutes. There's Alec Chisholm, born in Maryborough. There's Jean Galbraith, a garden writer, but she wrote about nature. Wonderful. From Gippsland. There's Edith Coleman, who was a suburban observer of copulation between a wasp and an orchid, and wrote 300 papers, many in scientific journals, self-taught sort of. And there's Jack Hyatt, born in Sebastopol, who wrote about the bush near Walden Hut because he was a school teacher at Mount Evelyn in books called A Bushman's Year and A Bushman's Harvest. So this is a picture of Alec Chisholm addressing a Victorian school girls when he's a young man. And I had a quote. Chisholm is someone who peoples his nature writing with sort of fairies and stuff, sort of a European fairy approach. But also he did start to think about Aboriginal past and talk about the uneasiness and the phantoms and the palpable power and life force. And this is quoted by Tim Winton in his collection of essays in The Island. And Winton is someone, I think, who could be considered in part of this nature writing that's contemporary. That is a picture of Chisholm on the left and the Beachcombers portrait, and Zara Holt and so forth, and Raphael Chilentos or Kilento, yeah. And this is a picture of Edith Coleman from the 1940s, Jack Hyatt on the right, and on the bottom is Jean Galbraith. Now, I've cut this back a bit, but Jean, I've just read her biography, Meredith Fletcher's book called Jean Galbraith, Writer in the Valley. And I thought she must be in the line for sainthood after that. She was sort of an amazing and pure woman, but she was part of the Christadelphian church and who believed that God or Jesus was coming back imminently and that they were just ready for it, like now, tomorrow. And but so she had this real wonderful passion and wrote beautifully. But mainly in the Australian Gardener. So Meredith Fletcher says you can find women's nature writing, but it's not always in the main stream. It was hidden in a way in these wonderful essays in the Australian Gardener. Now, what I tried to do now, and it's done better in the little booklet because my friend in Mount Evelyn got on her computer and said, I can do this, which I couldn't, was try to map. I tried to map, and the yellow is English, the white is North American, and the green is Australian, and those little highlighted yellow names are born in England, but in Australia. And there were people that wrote or attributed their inspiration, and so there were poets and nature writers and so forth. And Barrett was extremely important. And what I didn't say is that Barrett travelled with Thoreau's Walden with him every day of his First World War duty in Egypt, like a Bible. He had it. And when he met Jean Galbraith, he loaned that precious copy to her, and she put it on the desk under the sun where she could see nature, and she had treated it with reverence too. So we've got all these links with people, and the Woodlanders are in the block in the green, but yes, Galbraith obviously had a lot of... I tried to separate them spatially too, but it didn't quite work because I forgot that Gippsland was east, not west. Right. So what this network does is tries to assemble a bit of a picture of the development of Australian nature writing and the links. Many of those people were in Field Naturalist Society because when the book was launched by Gary Prestland, he said, all these people are friends to me. They're all part of the history of the field nats in Victoria, or almost all of them. So I just want to finish with a few thoughts. As I've said, that nature writing is not entirely a nationalistic or a male domain. There are women involved in children's literature, garden writing, and close to home observation in the suburbs of Melbourne, Blackburn. The Field Naturalists were a central institution, and what was special about it was that women and men shared those excursions, and they loved their campouts and bird watching and so forth. And it was respectable for those early times for men and women to attend those things together. And I think if you're looking for someone who's inherited Thoreau spirituality, it has to be Jean Galbraith. It's a wonderful book about her work. The other thing is that the European pagan fairy world animated the landscape in children's lit and in Alec Chisholm's work. And that because I've got an interest in colonists, I suppose, interest in Aboriginality, I sort of look for how they treated Aborigines and so forth in all these books and writings. And it does appear, sometimes they were quite negative. In the Woodlanders, originally they were sort of children of their times and had fairly restricted views about Aboriginal abilities and so forth. But they were fascinated by the culture and got involved with filming it and so forth. And this interest in Aboriginal culture sort of evolved from an interest in nature for two reasons, because they were living closer to nature and also because they knew so much about it if they actually got to meet Aboriginal people and see their knowledge. So recent writing acknowledges the Aboriginal past and the continual spiritual presence in landscape and that sort of conduit to spiritual uneasiness or experiences. And I think that might be my last. Just check that. That might be it. That's it, thank you. So I hope that gives you some ideas to think about and maybe some books to read. Thank you.